Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are cracking open Chapter 11 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology. And honestly, looking at the source material, this feels less like a biology lesson and more like a profile of two very different, very dangerous criminals.
It really does. We're looking at the genus Neisseria.
Which confusingly sounds like a nice flower or maybe a fancy dessert, but it's actually home to two of humanity's oldest enemies, Neisseria gonorrhoeae and Neisseria meningitidis.
The gonococcus and the meningococcus.
Exactly. And the fascinating part is that they're genetic siblings, but they have completely different methods of operation. One is like a stealth operative, and the other is basically a tank.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So before we get into their specific crimes, we should probably look at the family resemblance. If we're in a lab and we put a sample under the microscope, what are we actually seeing? The text makes a big deal about their shape.
It does, yeah. You're looking for kidney beans.
Kidney beans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Seriously, imagine two little red kidney beans with their flat sides pressed together. That is the classic diplococci shape. And they're gram-negative, which is why they show up red or pink after you stain them.
Okay, and there's a chemical test mentioned right at the top, the oxidase test. What's that about?
Right. That's a crucial first step in the lab. If you take a colony and you drop a specific region on it, it turns purple almost instantly. That means it's oxidase positive.
And that helps you narrow it down.
Oh, hugely. It helps you rule out a lot of other gram-negative rods that might be in your sample, like E. coli, which are oxidase negative.
So red kidney beans turns purple. We're likely dealing with Neisseria. But here's the kicker for me. These are obligate human pathogens. They don't live in dirt. They don't live in animals.
They only live in us. Humans are their only natural reservoir. I mean, that implies a very long, very intimate evolutionary history. They've evolved specifically to exploit our biology.
And the book describes them as pyogenic, which is just a polite medical way of saying they produce a lot of pus.
It is. The immune system reacts violently to them. It sends waves and waves of neutrophils, your white blood cells, to the site, and that creates the purulent discharge that is the hallmark of these infections.
Okay, let's separate the siblings. I want to start with the stealth operator, Neisseria gonorrhoeae.
The bug that causes gonorrhea.
The text highlights that this bacteria is incredibly fragile. It hates drying out. It hates temperature changes. It's a bit of a diva.
It really is highly sensitive to dehydration, and that tells you a lot about transmission. You aren't going to get gonorrhea from a toilet seat or a doorknob.
Right.
The bacteria just can't survive in that environment. It requires direct mucosal contact, usually sexual, to hop from one host to another.
So it's fragile outside the body, but once it gets inside, it has this incredible toolkit for survival. And the biggest surprise for me was that it doesn't have a capsule.
That is surprising. Usually a capsule is like heavy armor for a bacterium, but the gonococcus doesn't need armor because it has an incredible disguise kit. It relies heavily on something called pituli.
These are the little hair-like things sticking out of the cell surface, right?
Exactly, like tiny grappling hooks. Their main job is attachment. They grab onto our epithelial cells so the bacteria doesn't get washed away by, urine or mucus. But they also play this huge role in evading the immune system through something called antigenic variation.
This was the part that just blew my mind. It's like the bacteria has a wardrobe, right? It's wearing one type of pili protein, but it has the blueprints for a dozen others hidden away.
That's a great analogy. The bacteria has a single expression locus. Think of it as the display window, where the gene for the current purulent protein is active. But scattered through its DNA, it has about 20 silent genes.
Like clothes in storage.
Exactly. They don't have promoters, so they can't be used. But through a process called gene conversion, it can physically shuffle those silent genes into the display window.
It swaps the genetic cassette.
It does. So your immune system spends a week building antibodies to attack pili type A, just as those antibodies are ready to go.
The bacteria shuffles the deck and starts producing pili type B.
And suddenly your antibodies are useless. It's a shapeshifter.
Unbelievable.
And it doesn't stop with the pili. It does a similar thing with its OPA proteins.
These are the opacity proteins, right? The ones that make the colonies look cloudy in a petri dish.
Yes. They also help with adherence, but the expression of OPA proteins is controlled by phase variation. It's like an on-off switch that uses these little DNA repeats.
And the text mentions CTCTT repeats.
Right. So the bacteria can slip up during replication, adding or removing these repeats. That shifts the whole reading frame of the gene, so it can just randomly switch these surface proteins on or off, constantly changing how it looks to the immune system.
It's so devious. And it also messes with its outer shell, the LOS. We usually talk about LPS and gram negatives, but this is lipoligosaccharides.
Yeah, it's just a shorter version. Lacks the long O antigen side chains. But again, the gonococcus can vary the terminal sugars on the LOS. It can even mimic human cell surface markers to just hide in plain sight.
And while it's doing all this changing, it's also fighting back. We have to talk about the IgA protease.
The molecular scissors.
Exactly. Our body protects our mucous membranes by coating them with secretory IgA antibodies. It's our first line of defense.
Yeah.
And this bacteria just snips them.
It produces a specific enzyme that cleaves the IgA1 molecule right at the hinge region. It literally cuts the handcuffs off so it can keep moving.
And finally, it steals our supplies. It needs iron to grow, but our bodies keep iron locked up tight in proteins like transferrin and lactoferrin.
So the bacteria just produces its own special receptors that bind to our iron-carrying proteins and strip the iron right out of them. It exploits the very host mechanisms meant to starve it.
So we have this pathogen that can change its face, cut our antibodies, and steal our iron. When this highly equipped bug actually sets up shop, what does the clinical picture look like? Because the text suggests it's very different for men and women.
It is very different. In men, the infection is usually acute and, well, very obvious.
This is the classic urethritis.
Yes. You get a yellow, creamy, purulent discharge and severe dysuria, which is just painful urination. It usually starts a few days after exposure. And because it's so painful and visible, men usually seek treatment pretty quickly.
But for women, the bacteria plays a much more dangerous silent game.
Right. The primary site of infection is the endocervix. The problem is that a huge percentage of infected women, maybe half of them, are asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms they might ignore. A little discharge, maybe some spotting.
Which means they don't know they have it. So they become the unintentional reservoir for the spread of the disease. But just because it's silent doesn't mean it's harmless.
Far from it. This is where the anatomy is so important. If it's left untreated, the bacteria can ascend. It travels up the cervix, into the uterus, and into the fallopian tubes. This causes salpingitis and pelvic inflammatory disease, PID.
And PID isn't just an infection, it's a scarring event. That's the real danger.
Exactly. The inflammation leads to fibrosis. Scar tissue forms in those delicate fallopian tubes. And this is a leading cause of ectopic pregnancy and sterility. A woman might not even know she had gonorrhea until years later when she tries to have a child and can't.
That's just tragic. There's another vulnerable group mentioned, newborns.
Ophthalmia neonatorum. This is a severe eye infection, a purulent conjunctivitis that a baby gets while passing through an infected birth canal.
And we're not talking about a little pink eye here. This can cause blindness.
It can, and very quickly. It damages the cornea. That's why legally, in most places, we apply an erythromycin ointment to every newborn's eyes right after birth as a preventative measure.
The text also mentions silver nitrate.
That was the old school prophylaxis drops of silver nitrate. It worked, but it was pretty irritating to the eyes. We've mostly switched to antibiotics like erythromycin now, but the principle is the same. Treat immediately, just in case.
Now, usually gonorrhea stays local, but sometimes it breaks containment. Right.
Disseminated gonococcal infection. It's rare, maybe 1 to 3% of cases, but the bacteria gets into the bloodstream.
And it loves joints.
It really does. It causes septic arthritis. In fact, if you see a young sexually active adult with a hot, swollen, painful knee or ankle, gonorrhea should be at the top of your differential diagnosis. It also causes these little pustules on the skin of the extremities.
Let's move to the lab. We suspect gonorrhea. We grab a swab. The text says we can do a gram stain.
For men, yes, you can. If you see neutrophils just packed with gram-negative diplococci in the discharge, that's diagnostic. For women, it's less reliable because the normal vaginal flora can have other bacteria that look similar.
So you need to culture it.
Yeah.
And this is where you need the VIP section of agars.
Thayer-Martin medium.
It's a chocolate agar, which is just cooked blood agar, but it's spiked with a very specific antibiotic cocktail.
It has to be. The genital tract is a zoo of different bacteria. If you just used a regular agar plate, everything would grow and just swarm the Neisseria.
So Thayer-Martin contains what?
Vancomycin to kill gram-positives, colistin to kill other gram-negatives, nystatin to kill fungi, and trimethoprim to stop Proteus from swarming all over the plate.
So it basically kills everything except the Neisseria. It clears the room so our diva bacteria can grow.
Precisely.
Now, once it grows, we have to distinguish it from its cousin, the meningococcus. And there's a simple sugar test for this.
It's the classic biochemical differentiation. Neisseria gonorrhea metabolizes glucose. That's it. It does not touch maltose.
So G for gonorrhea, G for glucose only.
That's the one to remember.
Okay, treatment-wise, I feel like everyone knows about penicillin for gonorrhea, but the text says pretty clearly absolutely not.
Yeah, that ship sailed a long, long time ago. We saw the rise of what we call PPNG, penicillinase-producing N gonorrhea. These strains picked up plasmids that carry the gene for beta-lactamase, an enzyme that just destroys penicillin.
So we have to bring out the big guns.
Current standard of care is dual therapy. Ceftriaxone, which is given as a shot, plus oral azithromycin.
Why 2 drugs? To prevent resistance.
That's part of it, yes, but it's also because patients with gonorrhea often have a co-infection with chlamydia, and the azithromycin covers that too. It's a 2 birds, 1 stone approach.
And still no vaccine for this thing.
No. Remember that wardrobe of Piliac and the shifting OPA proteins? The surface changes so fast that we just can't pin down a stable target for a vaccine. That stealth strategy works a little too well.
Which brings us to the other sibling, the one that doesn't hide. Neisseria meningitidis, the meningococcus.
If gonorrhea is the stealth agent, meningitis is the tank.
And the reason it's a tank is one specific structural feature, the capsule.
This is the single most important difference. The meningococcus is encapsulated with this thick polysaccharide shell. The gonococcus is, well, naked.
And that capsule is what allows it to survive in the blood.
Exactly. It's antiphagocytic. Immune cells just bounce right off it. This allows the bacteria to multiply like crazy in the bloodstream and then travel to the brain.
The text classifies them based on that capsule into serogroups.
Right, there are 13 of them, but A, B, C, W, and Y are the ones that cause almost all the disease.
And the geography changes, right? Like serogroup A is the big one in Africa.
Yeah, specifically in the meningitis belt in sub-Saharan Africa. Here in the US and in Europe, we tend to see more of B and C.
Now, transmission here is completely different. This isn't sexual. It's respiratory.
Airborne droplets. Coughing, sneezing, sharing drinks. The bacteria enters your body through the nasopharynx.
And scary enough, you can just carry it and not be sick.
Carriers are very common. Depending on the population, maybe 5 to 10% of people could be carrying meningococcus in their throat at any given time, completely asymptomatic.
But certain environments spike that risk. The text mentions close quarters.
Dormitories and military barracks, those are the classic high-risk settings. You put a lot of young people from different places into a small room, stress them out, mix up their microbiomes. It's a perfect recipe for an outbreak.
There's also a specific biological risk factor mentioned, complement deficiency.
This is really high yield. Patients who have a deficiency in the terminal complement components, that's C5 through C9, are at a massive risk.
Why is that?
Those complement proteins form what's called the membrane attack complex, which basically drills holes in bacteria. Neisseria is particularly susceptible to that complex. If you don't have it, you have no drill, and the bacteria can survive and thrive.
So let's trace the path. It starts in the nose, it crosses the mucosal barrier into the blood.
And that's meningococcemia. Unlike gonorrhea, which rarely goes systemic, this bug thrives in the blood. And from the blood, it can cross the blood-brain barrier to infect the meninges, the membranes covering the brain and spinal cord.
And that leads to meningitis.
The symptoms are rapid and violent. We're talking high fever, a splitting headache, and a stiff neck-neutral rigidity.
Plus vomiting and sensitivity to light. But there's a visual sign on the body that is a major red alert, the rash.
The petechial rash. These are small, non-blanching red or purple spots. If you press a glass against them, they don't fade. That's actually blood leaking from capillaries into the skin. It's a very bad sign.
So if you see fever, plus a stiff neck, plus that rash...
You act immediately. You don't
Bam.
wait for the lab. You start antibiotics, because this can progress to Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. What is happening there?
It's fulminant septicemia. The bacterial load gets so high that it triggers massive widespread blood clotting, what we call DIC. The patient goes into shock. But specifically, it causes hemorrhage into the adrenal glands.
Adrenal necrosis. The adrenal glands die.
Yes. The adrenal glands fail, leading to a sudden, catastrophic loss of blood pressure and circulatory collapse. A healthy person can die within 10 to 12 hours of the first symptom.
That speed is just hard to comprehend.
It is. It's why meningitis is considered one of the top medical emergencies.
So let's talk prevention. Unlike its stealthy cousin, we can vaccinate against this one.
We can, because the capsule is a stable target. We have the MCV4 conjugate vaccine that covers serogroups A, C, W, and Y.
But for a long time, there wasn't a shot for Group B. Why was B so special?
The capsule of Group B is made of polysialic acid. The problem is, our own nervous system uses similar sialic acids as cell markers, so the Group B capsule looks like self to our immune system.
So we couldn't make a vaccine against it because that would be like telling our body to attack itself.
Exactly. But recently, new vaccines were developed using proteins from underneath the capsule, so we finally have protection against Group B as well.
Amazing. Okay, we're nearing the end of the chapter. We've got these two very distinct diseases. Let's just run through the high-yield differentiators from the summary chart.
Let's do it.
First up, maltose fermentation.
Gonococcus. Negative. Meningococcus. Positive. Just remember M for meningitis and M for maltose.
Second, the capsule.
Gonococcus. None, it's naked. Meningococcus. Yes, it's armored.
And third, vaccines.
Gonococcus. None because of that antigenic variation. Meningococcus. Yes, we target the stable capsule. Simple enough. Finally, just to round things out, there are two other bugs mentioned that can look similar but aren't Neisseria, the imposters.
Right. Moraxella catarrhalis is one. It's a respiratory pathogen, causes ear infections in kids, COPD flare-ups in smokers.
It looks like a gram-negative diplococci, and it's oxidase positive. So how do we tell it apart?
The sugars. Moraxella does not ferment glucose or our maltose. It's asaccharidic,
And the other one?
Acinetobacter. It can look like a coccus on a stain, but it's actually short-rod. The key difference is the oxidase test. Acinetobacter is oxidase negative.
Okay, so that's the lineup. We have the stealthy gonococcus, the armored meningococcus, and the lookalikes.
It's a perfect example of how two bacteria can start from the same genetic blueprint, but evolve completely different strategies to survive in the human host.
That's really the thought I'm walking away with, the stealth versus tank dynamic. You have the gonococcus, which has no capsule, no animal reservoir. It's incredibly fragile. I mean, it should be extinct. But it survives by being a master illusionist, constantly shuffling its genetic deck to stay one step ahead. And then you have the meningococcus, which just puts on a helmet, breaks down the door, and tries to overwhelm the system with brute force. Both strategies work, and both are incredibly dangerous.
Well, on that cheerful note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into Chapter 11.
Always a pleasure to decode the microbes.
Thanks to everyone for listening. This is the Last Minute Lecture team signing off. Wash your hands, stay safe, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.